Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody here today. Thank you for coming out. It's a wonderful day out there. My name is Toby Matava, and I'm Assistant Professor in Social Science and Humanities at the University Library. I'm also the Subject Specialist for Asian American Studies. Last fall, Dr. Jane Dusselier invited Grace Amamiya to one of her anthropology courses on the peoples and cultures of Asian America. Before attending that class, many of the students had never even heard about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Organizing this event today grew out of the discussions in that classroom. So on behalf of Dr. Jane Dusselier, the students in Anthropology 326, the wonderful sponsors of this program today that made it all possible for us, I'd like to welcome you to what I hope is just the first of many annual Day of Remembrance events at Iowa State. 67 years ago, on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order allowed the U.S. military to forcibly remove over 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes and incarcerate them in concentration camps spread across the country. Since the early 1980s, Day of Remembrance events have been held across the country to honor those who suffered as a result of this unconstitutional and unwarranted action by our government. So today we have three very special guests to help us remember this event. Neil Nakadaki is a university professor in the Department of English. His mother, along with the rest of her family, were interned at Minidoka in Idaho, and he's going to start us off by reading a couple of very special original poems. Our first speaker, Grace Amamiya, became a resident of Ames, Iowa 48 years ago. She was born in Vacaville, California, the daughter of Tatsuguro and Retsu Obata. At the age of 21, while a student at the University of California, Berkeley, Pearl Harbor happened and Executive Order 9066 went into action. Grace and her family were first removed to Turlock Assembly Center and later were settled at Gila River, Arizona, one of the 10 Japanese American concentration camps. Grace was forced to abandon her education at that time. Fortunately, as part of the Nisei Nurse Cadet Corps, she was later able to finish her education in Rochester, Minnesota, and eventually came to work in a military hospital in Clinton, Iowa. Phil Nash, our other speaker, has been involved in civil rights issues for over 30 years, starting with his work on the movement to redress the unjust incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. He went on to serve as the founding legal director of the National Asian Pacific American Legal Consortium, now called the Asian American Justice Center, and was a staff attorney for the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. He has been teaching Asian American studies and law for over 25 years, first at City College in New York, at Yale University, at New York University, and Georgetown University Law Center. Currently, he teaches at the University of Maryland in College Park, writes a weekly column for Asian Week, which I just learned is no longer publishing, and serves as the CEO of two award-winning website development firms that provide internet tools for progressive campaigns and causes. Phil received his BA in Urban Design Studies from New York University and his JD from Rutgers University Law School. We're going to begin the program with Dr. Nakadaki. Then Grace will talk for about 25 minutes, followed by Phil Nash. And then at the very end, we have a special presentation by Dean Zora Zimmerman from the Letters and Sciences and an early supporter of this Day of Remembrance event. So thank you all for coming. Dr. Nakadaki.
Thank you. Well, this entire experience is about disrupted lives, among many other things, and that's what this first poem is about. It has to do with baseball. It's titled Home and Away. And I refer to Lake LaBiche. It's a community outside of Salem, Oregon. And Salem, Yamato. Yamato is kind of a traditional reference to Japan. So it's part of Japanese culture. And I have a note here. During the 1920s and 1930s, baseball flourished in every Japanese-American settlement across the American West and Hawaii. Most of these players were Nisei. They were born in the United States, young men who had been born from immigrant parents. Home and away. They scrapped and hustled on the coast where they were born, but also took their game far beyond Seattle, Portland, Stockton, and San Pedro, some barnstorming to Japan, or east to Kansas, Oklahoma. Opposing clubs would marvel that these little chaps could field and hit so well, surprised their English wasn't half bad either. Sometimes they scheduled prison teams who played all games at home, not knowing that some bad calls after Pearl Harbor would make them close their own careers behind barbed wire, go the distance for Hart Mountain, Poston, Topaz, Manzanar, Minidoka. Before the war, my father, working his way through college by hauling produce into town on the way to morning classes, was one of the boys from Lake LaBiche who tended lettuce, peas, and broccoli until the weekend came around. Excuse me. And Salem Yamato would pile into a mud-crusted Chevy and the celery truck with a mattress in the bed, dreaming of becoming Yankees. This poem's titled Minidoka, Idaho, Winter 1944-45. And I refer in the poem to Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio, who both, of course, were players with the New York Yankees. One from a German background, the other from an Italian background. The two other countries that the United States was at war with at the time. The Japanese-American unit that the 442nd Combat Team trained in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and I refer to Hattiesburg. Most of you know that during the war, the families of soldiers placed a blue star for if they had a soldier in the military, in a window of their home, and a gold star if they had lost a member of their family in combat. Minidoka, Idaho, winter 1944-45. Across this hostile, unclaimed land, uprooted people struggle to believe in windy desert spaces. Here the numbered barracks of the dispossessed, watched by soldiers and barbed wired, for safety all around, are leaking grit and cold. Bleach green sagebrush gestures at survival as far as the sawtooth range. This is no place for angry faith, and to prove themselves as American as Gehrig and DiMaggio, to take a hack at Hitler, Mussolini, or even those damned Japs, many young men have left for the 442. At Hattiesburg, they met water moccasins, swamps, and Mississippi heat, learned to fire a service pistol and an automatic rifle, and were warned about the back of the bus when going into town. Overseas, from Anzio to Bifontaine, snipers and shrapnel have cut their ranks in half, and Purple Hearts and telegrams become their families' valentines. Here people can count on casualty lists from week to week, censored mail, and letters of regret. Ennui and empty days accumulate for mothers, fathers, and lonely brand new brides, busy with worry in a place that offers little room for hope, no future but what the past has given. Gold stars shine in the desert night, and dust settles on the window panes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So nice to be here, and thank you all for being here. And as I was introduced as an 88-year-old woman, senior moments do catch up with me, so I apologize if I struggle through this all. But as she had mentioned, that I was a student nurse at the University of California School of Nursing when Pearl Harbor happened. And so I'll start out by saying that it started out like a very ordinary morning, and a classmate and I were studying in her room and listening to the radio. And all of a sudden, this ordinary morning became a nightmare when the music stopped and the radio stopped, and an announcer somberly reported that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor. Of course, it was December 7th, 1941. On the West Coast, it was immediately had blackouts, with shades drawn and curtains closed and sirens blaring, especially around San Francisco where I was. And it was just really definitely a war hysteria. There was no TV back then, for all of you who might have remembered those days. And so we depended upon the radio for press news. And, of course, they reported all of a sudden, after the Pearl Harbor bombing, it's so peaceful. You can't trust them. You can't trust them. They are a menace and a yellow peril. But there was racial discrimination even before Pearl Harbor, especially out in the West Coast. And it was beyond their comprehension that the non-Caucasians like us who spoke an alien tongue along with our English could be good American citizens, and many viewed us with fear. It was American racism at its worst. We soon had a curfew from 8 at night till 6 in the morning, and travel restrictions of 5 miles from home. And within 24 hours, the FBI started picking up people who they thought were possible saboteurs and sent them to federal campsites, none of whom were ever proven guilty of any crime. Those people were like officers of Japanese associations, Japanese school teachers, and of course, in newspaper men and all. And this was something that was really, really amazing that it happened so soon after Pearl Harbor. We were required to surrender all firearms, radios with shortwave bands, because they did not want us to be talking to Japan. Some long-bladed knives even. And so that was how we had to give up a lot of our things. And the Western Defense Command set up for this evacuation. Executive Order 9066 was signed, as we have been told, on February 19th of 1942. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. They gave the military authority to remove undesirables, that is, aliens from Japan, and us, American-born citizens of Japanese lineage, up to those with 1/16 of Japanese blood. And I might add right at this time that this executive order did include the Germans and the Italian descent also. But as you can look at each other and you can't tell what kind of blood you all have. Look at me, I'm Asian. So anyway, those of the Chinese lineage had their difficulty because, so they started wearing buttons that said, I am Chinese, or I am Chinese American, so that they would not be picked up as suspected Japanese personnel. Martial law was deemed not necessary. However, the military favored the mass evacuation of the Japanese and the Japanese Americans from the states along the Pacific coast. So the areas involved was state of California, parts of Oregon, Washington, and Arizona. And voluntary mass evacuation was encouraged, but that was ineffective. So then it began. No Japs allowed. Japs stay away. Japs keep moving. Go home to Japan. Were some of the hateful and hurtful derogatory signs posted on windows of homes and businesses, and often shouted at us personally. And the question was often asked, why, as American citizens born in the United States, did we not protest and refuse to go to camp? Well, the government told us that this was the only way that we could prove our loyalty to the United States. Therefore, most of us went peacefully. Of course, there were groups of citizens, though, who defiantly disobeyed the order, and they were sent to jail. And at that time, the voices of the friends of civil rights and religious groups were neither strong enough nor loud enough to help us at this crucial time. And so the War Relocation Authorities sent out their orders. We were to dispose of our homes, properties, business ventures, or have our Caucasian friends look after our things. And some of the things they said that we could store and be left behind, and they thought it would be safe. But while we were gone, many of these were vandalized. And I know our personal things were vandalized. And so we never saw the things that we had left behind, hopefully being able to pick them up after we returned. For some of us, the monetary value of our losses may not have been great. We were a modest family, but memorabilia and parts of our life's history were gone forever. When questions were asked, where were we going? What was going to happen to us? Would we be allowed to return? Would our families be separated? Adults and children, husbands and wives, and for how long? Who were our friends? No one in authority could tell us, as this had never happened before in the United States of America. Then a few months later, the Civilian Exclusion Order 5 was declared, and this was April the 1st in 1942. And we immediately had to register the family unit. And so we were given a number. And so it was that our family number was 6259. My name was Grace Obata. My family name was Obata. My family number was 6251. We registered as a family unit, and this was that we had to put like baggage tag numbers on whatever we carried with us to camp, and also to wear on the outside of our outer garments when we left for camp. We were to be notified 5 or 7 days before the departure date, and we could take a duffel bag with bedding and linens for each member of the family. The government said that they would get them to camp for us, plus 2 suitcases of clothing and things that we needed. But that was only the things that we could carry by ourselves. So then, but remember, in those days, suitcases didn't have wheels like they do now. And they weren't as big, and they were mostly leather and heavy and all. But that was the things that we could take with us. And along with that, we had to take our own dishes and silverware, toilet articles, and everything that we thought we'd need. And these were all packaged, tied, and tagged with 6251. Okay, what does one take on a long journey into the unknown? We didn't know where we were going or how long we would be gone. And you might think about that. I know when I talked to some college students and I said, hey, how much luggage did you bring when you came for the semester? And they said, oh, about 2 cars full, you know. And I said, well, we only could take 2 suitcases, and we didn't even know where we were going, you know. But anyway, when you think about it, we started life with 2 suitcases when we left home. The students had to quit school, leave our homes and our jobs, friends and pets. And talking about pets And I talked to many different groups of age groups, and I was talking to some youngsters and telling them that we couldn't take a lot of toys and we couldn't take your pets. And one little youngster said to me, Grace says, I'm going to take my dog. And I said, well, honey, the government said that you couldn't take your pets. But you told me that I could take 2 suitcases. And I'm going to put my dog in one of them. And he looked at me and said, but I'll punch holes in it so I can breathe. You know? So bless the younger generation on things like that. Yeah. But anyway, as we said, some of the employees were fired and all, and some had to return home because members of the family had been picked up by the FBI or because of dangerous conditions in the neighborhood. I had one brother, Ted, who was in the U.S. military at that time already under the selective service policy, which said that you had to have a year of military service. And he was between his 2 years of junior college and wanting to finish up his second 2 years. And he was stationed in Monterey, California, training as a machine gun. But he and the other American Japanese soldiers were also transferred inland with us. Ted was being sent to a fort in inland, and he had been training as a machine gunner. But when they took him inland and put him into a fort, they put him in the office to do filing. That was until the government wanted the soldiers back on, and he was sent overseas with a segregated 442 unit as a machine gunner again. Other young men and women in camp of military age were denied enlistment and put into 4C category, that is, enemy aliens, although we had all been born citizens of the United States of America. The assembly centers were opened in May of 42. The permanent camps were ready for us, and so we were at temporary camps. And we were transferred to Turlock Assembly Center, which was a county fairgrounds. But other centers were established, State Fairgrounds and other existing buildings, hastily constructed tar paper barracks and even racetracks, housing families in whitewashed horse stalls. And I know I hadn't realized that, but my husband, I wasn't married at that time, but he and his family from San Francisco, and they said that they were in Tanforan racetrack and were living in one stall, the whole family. We had lived in a small community, and we were fortunate to have many wonderful Caucasian friends, and they were so nice, and so many of them had come to the bus depot with loving care packages, but they jeopardized themselves as they were labeled as Jap lovers by some of the other residents. But on reaching our campsite, everything that we carried was opened and inspected. We were subjected to very tight security checks. Our barracks were small and all that, and all were in the room, and separate cot beds for each one of us, mattresses with cloth bags with loose straws. And the upper parts of the walls, of course, between the units were open, and so if there were 6 units in a barrack, you were able to hear the conversation and noises of all the other people who lived in the same building. So you heard laughter, angry words, crying, snoring, and some things that you wish you hadn't heard too. But we were subjected to bed check morning and evenings at our barracks and internal security checks through the campsite. And the necessity of life, though, had to go on. And a community life was set up, educational programs, social, religious, and medical programs. Meals were eaten at a communal dining hall, and I worked as a nurse at the hospital since I had been a student nurse. The salary scale that we were given were according to how professional we were, $8, $12, $16 a month. And we said, $16 a month for working 40 hours a week? But our comment always was, we did get free board and room from the government at that time. So we all did our best to keep busy, but we were always apprehensive regarding our future. What was going to happen to us? And after about 3 months, in August of 42, we were transferred to our permanent camps. And this, of course, was our America's concentration camps. 10 camps were established for us, 2 each in Arizona, Arkansas, California, and then 1 each in Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. These were the tar-papered villages, hurriedly built barracks designed for troops rather than for family living. And the 1940 census showed that there were about 126,000 Japanese and Americans of Japanese descent living in the United States. 70% of us were born as American citizens, and 9 out of 10 of us lived in the 3 western states. And according to the U.S. law, the immigrants of Japan, I think there are nearly 50,000 of them, were considered aliens ineligible for citizenship. They had been denied the opportunity to become citizens. And the evacuation itself involved about 120,000 people. And when you think of all the children and students that we had there, and so there were about 30,000 school-age children of second and third generation, and for whom schooling had to be provided in the camps. I might add right now that the estimated cost of our mass evacuation at that time was over $88 million in 1940 currency. Think of what it would be now. Our families were sent to camp at Gila, Arizona, which was near Phoenix, and this was in August. We were transported in antiquated trains as the military was still using the good ones for the troop transports, and the MPs guarded us with loaded rifles, bayonets mounted, and wearing sidearms. The shades were drawn on these trains, and we wondered, was this for us not to see out, or maybe so outsiders could not see us? We were given a rest stop in the desert to stretch our legs. Well, it was an awfully hot, hot time when you figured that the temperature in the deserts were over 130 degrees at that time in August. They said that Gila, Arizona, is often listed as the hottest spot in the United States in the summer. And according to the maps, I think that you might have realized this. They said it was very hot and dry, windy and dusty, but I must admit the sunsets were just beautiful. And the camp was not completed when we arrived in August. And so the water and sanitation facilities were all still under construction. So it was a very, very dismal picture. So if you can picture this, over 10,000 men, women, children, and babies surrounded by barbed wire fence, locked gates, number of sentry towers, machine gunners with their guns pointed inwardly at us 24 hours a day, and spotlights shining all night. It was said by some that internment was for our protection, and we say, if so, why were the guns pointed at us instead of outwardly? Unfortunately, there were some accidental deaths due to misunderstandings between the MPs and older folks who were either confused by the commands or did not hear them because of being hard of hearing. But once again, we settled in community living. The barracks, there were about 200 or 250 per block, and each block had a community bathhouse. If you wanted to take a shower, multiple shower heads without any stalls or curtains. When you had to go to the bathroom, toilet seats back to back without partitions. There was absolutely no privacy when we first went to camp. Our dining hall seated 250 or 300 per seatings for the meals. And they said that the cost of the meals was 35 cents a day for each person. We stood in line with our dishes and our silverware. And there weren't enough seats for all of us, so there were 3 group calls, and we went into the dining hall and did our eating, left, and the next group was then sent in. And as I said, each camp had about 3,000 school-age children because there were about 30,000 of them. And the mess halls were used as classrooms until the permanent buildings could be taken over. And internees, we said, well, where did the teachers come from? Internees who were teachers, college students, or graduates took over the teaching responsibilities of all these students, and under the supervision of the few civil service employed teachers. It was truly amazing that the education program did so well. Some students wrote back to their former teachers and classmates, and they responded so generously with books and supplies that were not being used. And the students wrote letters of encouragement back to the camps. Some students wrote, "We went to school, and you weren't there, and nobody told us what happened to you. So glad to hear from you and know that you're well." Club service, church services had to be conducted. Christians and Buddhist churches were discouraged for a long time, and because it was mostly done in the Japanese language. Social activities, recreational sports, arts and crafts classes, and many other activities filled the free time for the young and old. And many of the immigrants who had been too busy to working and raising their families now found themselves time free on their hands and were able to pursue their interests in arts, crafts, hobby, gardening, and all. And these people amazed us with their artistic talents, and pieces of the work were found now in museums and libraries in many states. And it was something, though. The civil service personnel were so friendly and so nice. And some of us became very good friends, and we kept up our friendship even after leaving camp. I might add just a little point of interest and talk about small world. Our social worker in our camp in Gila was a fabulous young man, and he just kept up the enthusiasm and our spirits up and all that. And it happens now that after all these years, his son is here in Ames now with Rich Church, and we have just become such wonderful friends because I'm able to tell him what his father was like when he was 25 years old. And so it's just wonderful. But once again, our barracks were barren, and it was just one cot per person with mattresses. No sink, no running water, no bathroom, one light bulb overhead. So to make our barracks homey, we had to build pieces of furniture. And you say, well, what did you make your furniture with? And we went out and liberated scrap lumber from the government. Where they had built barracks and they had scrap. And so we'd go out, the fellas, and we'd go out in the late evenings, and they'd say, if the MPs see you and they start chasing us, says, you gals go one way and we'll go the other, because I'm sure they'll chase us, But fortunately, we weren't caught doing this, but it was amazing. Benches, chairs, tables, all the furniture that unless you had bought and had them sent in, like those people who had money, Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck did a wonderful job with all that. We used sheets to make curtains. Blankets were hung on ropes to stretch across the room to partition our dwellings for some privacy. My brother put up a rope, and during the day there were the sheets and the blankets, because there were my brother, two brothers, my sister and I and Mom, 5 of us in a 20 by 20 room. So workers were needed in all the jobs that were required to run camp, the offices, security, and all the jobs that were, and like as nurses, doctors, the dentists, lawyers, and all. And also then we had to help the surrounding communities with their sugar beets and harvesting and vegetable crops, because their men had been sent off to the war also. So our group would go out during the day, but always coming back to camp. The mental health of some of the residents deteriorated as depression overtook them. Others made new friends. Some fell in love, married, had babies. Accidents, yes, happened. Others died and were buried in a camp cemetery. So life went on in these camps, which were more physically suited for the camps, rather than for families who were trying to live as normal a life as possible. So, And one thing, too, though, there was a breakup of families because we ate in these mess halls and all. And the father was not the breadwinner anymore. And also, if you, like I worked at the hospital, so I ate my meals at the hospital. The students didn't come back to their home areas. They would eat with their friends. And it got more and more so that it was not, it was truly a breakdown of family togetherness like we had been used to. And the government, so anyway, that was a sad situation. The government had reclassified the military age of American citizens to 4C as enemy aliens. Then in 1943, the young men in camp were asked to volunteer for service to prove their loyalty. Yes, we had lost our citizenship, but they wanted us to prove our loyalty. The president approved an all-Japanese-American segregated unit to fight in the European front, where they needed the soldiers. The military also needed those with the Japanese language background who could be more easily trained for intelligence work in the Pacific. Some of the families whose sons did volunteer were ridiculed and threatened by those who opposed the idea. And the questions and arguments were, why are we sending our boys to be killed when here we are incarcerated? Why fight for a country that had placed their parents behind barbed wire fence? As we read, I had a brother, as I said before, in the military already, and his year was up January, but he stayed in the military. And then now, when we in camp, my brother Ben was one of the first volunteers from our camp to go. And, you know, my mother was threatened. They would say to her, says, here you are, a widow. My father died when I was 10, so Mom, we were in a single-parent familyhood. And says, here you are, a widow, already have one son fighting. Why are you sending another son to be killed? And that was the argument that they were giving, and my mother was truly threatened about this. But my brother Ben, the one who volunteered from camp, stayed in for 25 years. He retired as a lieutenant colonel and is buried now at Arlington Cemetery. And it's ironic in a way. But I'm proud of both. Of course, my brothers and, of course, my husband Ben also have been in service. But anyway, most of the Japanese-American soldiers from Hawaii served in the segregated, again, 100th Infantry Battalion. And the stateside volunteers, another segregated 442 Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service units were sent to the Pacific. The segregated units were highly decorated for their service and had the highest casualty rate of the units in the size in the U.S. military. So in spite of prejudices, they served just as loyally as many of your family members who fought in the military during World War II. The first head of the Rural Relocation Authority was Milton Eisenhower, brother of General Dwight Eisenhower, and then Dillon S. Meyer, who even by 42 realized the error of the order to evacuate and was anxious to get us out of camp. This was the first mass evacuations in the history of the United States. No precedent, no guidelines, no policies. Never before 10 cities populated by people who were and were not prisoners, who did not have their civil rights. Disillusioned. Some were bitter, but remarkably were determined to make the best of their misfortune. So slowly we went back into the mainstream. An FBI clearance was required to leave camp, and one also had to have an offer of a definite job or be accepted at a school or have a family or member friends who would vouch for us so that we would never become a ward of any state when released from camp. The National Student Relocation Council, the Quakers, and American Friends Service, to name a few, helped open channels which the evacuees could return to life outside of camp and continue their uninterrupted education, their profession, and get back into the mainstream of their lives. But then the West Coast was still off limits at that time. On April of 43, I left camp and took a job in Lake Forest, Illinois with my former nursing school roommate, because we had been writing to different nursing schools and were getting negative reports, and they would say, I'm sorry, but the quota of your type has been filled. They never told us what their quota was. Or they would say, oh, we'd love to have you back at our school, but we don't feel that the patients are ready to have you here. And so it went, or the community was not ready to accept us. And so we decided to go out to work and keep on trying to get back into nursing. When we took our job with the understanding that if we were accepted at any school, we would be leaving them, because we did not want to take our jobs with false pretenses of thinking that we were going out for good. We were finally accepted by St. Mary's School of Nursing in Rochester, Minnesota, as members of the U.S. Cadet Nurse Corps, whose stipulation was that after finishing our training, we would remain working nurses while the war was still on. And as I had two brothers in the service, I preferred the Army. And as the last 6 months as a senior cadet, we could specialize in what type of nursing we would like to go into. And so I asked if I could go to an Army hospital. And later on, I was accepted. And later on, I found out that I was one of the earlier Nisei, American Japanese student nurses that the Army Nurse Corps had accepted to help and for us to become senior cadets in an Army hospital. I was at Schick General Army Hospital in Clinton, Iowa, and so there it was so nice to be accepted by the Army Nurse Corps. And you know, it was really something. It was what a wonderful experience it was for me, and I'll never, ever forget. And I was so grateful for the government and the U.S. Cadet Nurse Corps for their program, which made me finally finish up so I could become a registered nurse. And we had incidences. I had some wonderful incidences while we were at the Army hospital. But the war ended while I was still at an Army hospital. And so our boys who were POWs and patients in Japan as enemy aliens there, I mean, prisoners, I should say, but they were going to be brought back. And the captain, there were two of us cadet nurses and of Japanese descent, and she called us in and said, we don't know what the reaction is going to be when the soldiers come back from Japan, where they had been prisoners of war, and find an Asian-faced nurse to take care of them. And this was what was worrying the captain. And she said, you're living in officers' quarters, but you cannot go to the hospital or come back from the hospital without an escort until we find how safe it is for you all to be around these prisoners who had been in Japan. And bless the ambulatory soldiers that we had been taking care of heard about this, and they immediately reported to the captain and said, don't worry, Captain, we'll be their escorts. You don't have to sign up anybody. And what a wonderful, wonderful feeling it was to feel the love and concern of the soldiers that we had been taking care of. And we did have a wonderful experience also with the fellows who were our patients when they came back. And so it is that it was just our experience at the Army Hospital was just a blessing for us too. And so the war ended before I finished my nurse's training, and so I graduated in February and returned to Cleveland, Ohio, where my family had relocated before when they left internment camp, and became a registered nurse and worked at the Western Reserve University Hospital there. And there I was working, and then my husband-to-be, Min Amamiya, whom I had met back in Cal days back in 1938. A lot of you weren't even born then, you know. But anyway, he came back from his military intelligence work in Tokyo, and we were married in Cleveland in 1947. And then he went on to do his graduate work at Ohio State. So I worked at the Student Health Center and worked there while he did his graduate work. And then he worked for, being in agriculture, USDA. We went head for Grand Junction, Colorado. We're there, and we had 2 boys. Our firstborn was mentally disadvantaged. Bless him. He passed away about 6 years ago here in Iowa. And our second son, Robert, who is now living in California, but he graduated from Iowa State, 77, and has been married to a beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed gal from Michigan. So if being Ohio State and Michigan used to be our arch enemies, but I had to change my mind about a few things there. But the West Coast was later open for relocation, but racial discrimination was still prevalent in many places. And it was just something that, had happened. And it's interesting semantics. They said relocatees from relocation centers and evacuees from evacuation centers. And then they said so that they would not have to say that we were prisoners from concentration camps. But in closing, we were incarcerated, charged with no crime, United States-born citizens not proven guilty in any court of law, but by the stroke of the pen of the then President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we were taken away from our homes, put into camps, stripped of our freedom and our civil rights as citizens, and also subject to military law without martial law being declared. And this incarceration was an insult, truly, to our constitutional liberties as citizens of the United States of America. We were charged with only one crime, being born, yes, American citizens, but of Japanese descent, with Oriental features and living in the wrong part of the United States. America, acknowledged as a world leader of civil and human rights, selectively suspended the Bill of Rights for American citizens of Japanese ancestry. Incarceration in the concentration camp in America, yes, but may never, ever happen again to any group of loyal American citizens. And may our experience as an example of one of the most disgraceful incidents of our government never be repeated again. After, the 9/11 devastating actions of the terrorists, we are made more aware of the fact that we cannot ourselves accuse anyone or everyone just because, like at this time, the Arab Americans or the Muslim Americans living in this country as being guilty. So please help us understand their sorrow and show our concern and acceptance to those who are loyal citizens. Racial profiling, racial discrimination, and hatred can be so devastating and hurtful. In October of 1990, 48 years after our internment, a redress and apology was signed by our President, George Bush, along with monetary restitution for economic hardship and the government's wrongdoing given to those who had been interned and were still alive on that date. Those who had passed away before that date were never recognized. And so then they received this letter from the White House, and it says, "A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. Neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold the rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize the serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. And in enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, you fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitments to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. You and your family have our best wishes for the future. Sincerely, George Bush, President of the United States, October 1990. And so each one of us who were still alive at that time received this letter from the President and a monetary check of $20,000. And my husband had made a copy of it on my letter so that I'd always have remembered that. But anyway, the question is often asked why men and I have never expressed any bitterness concerning what our government had done to us. And one has to forgive any wrongdoing of which we have no control over. And anger and bitterness would destroy your life. And one has to have a positive outlook and try to help others to understand what the government has done to us and to see that never happens to any loyal citizens of the United States of America. And Min and I felt that hopefully by our presentations that we have been giving, we've helped towards this end in some small way. Yes, please, forgive, learn from your experience, keep a positive attitude, and hopefully we will become better, understanding citizens, and we will face the future with an open and caring heart and mind. So do the best you can with whatever circumstances are thrown your way. And thank you so very much.
Hi. Let's have another round of applause for our poet and our speaker. And these are really very moving. We're very fortunate to hear firsthand experiences like that and to hear such creative, the poems were very moving and the personal presentations very moving. I want to speak today about another person who was in the camps. Her name was Michi Nishiura Weglin. And she wrote a book called Years of Infamy. We have a copy here. We've got some copies available on the table back there, along with Grace's book. So actually, if you enjoyed hearing Grace's talk, she actually has written a very interesting book that's got a lot of great stuff in it. So both of those books are available over there. I want to talk about Michi because she was a person who was very inspirational to me. And I think it's very appropriate for us to talk about her at a university setting because I think she will be very inspirational for the students as well once they hear about her life. So I just want to quickly show a couple pictures from her life. Here's Michi with her husband Walter, who was a person of Jewish ancestry from the Netherlands. He unfortunately was put in the death camps in Europe, and he was one of two boys from a village of 2,000 people of Jewish ancestry who survived the camp experience. And the two of them came together, each of them with their unique camp experience. And Walter was very instrumental in encouraging Michi to write this book. This is them when they got married. It's interesting to juxtapose them as young people. Yes, you young people will start to look like us with the gray hair after a while. So luckily their love was still there many years later. And here's Michi right at the end of her life when she received an award from Cal Polytechnic in Pomona, California. And there's Walter as well. So before getting into Michi's life, though, I would like to thank the president and everyone here at the university for having this day of remembrance. It's very, very important that we have these days of remembrance because we truly do have to understand the past if we don't want to repeat some of the mistakes that we've made in the past. And this was truly one of the biggest mistakes in American history. The civil liberties and civil rights deprivations of Japanese Americans were quite horrific. Of course, there were similar deprivations that were carried out against the Native Americans right at the beginning of this country, African Americans for hundreds of years, Latinos, and others. One thing that I talked about in one of your classes this morning was just how this history has been repeated again and again against even people who are quote-unquote white. The discrimination visited against people of South European, Eastern European, Catholic religion, people from Ireland. Many, many people have suffered discrimination in this country, and it's only through beautiful presentations like this where people like yourselves come and celebrate these Japanese American people. There aren't that many of you who are Japanese American, yet all of you are taking your time, your valuable time to come here and learn about other people. This is what is so beautiful about this country. Each of you wants to take the time to learn about other people, and I congratulate you as an ISU community for taking the time and spending your time and your money to build your multicultural programs, your Asian American Studies programs. You have a wonderful multicultural center here. Each of you wants to learn about other people, and it's very, very important at an academic institution that we do this, because ISU is a world leader at this time, but ISU is going to be sending out an engineer, for example, who's going to be going out, and he or she is going to be working in Saudi Arabia. Or you might have an agronomist who's going to go be working in sub-Saharan Africa. We have to have people who are trained and ready to work with people of different cultures, people who are different from us, people who have different religions, people who have different customs. I was talking to a student at my law school a couple years ago, and she was a Latina. And somebody said that she had cheated in a test situation. So I walked into a room, and I looked at her, and her eyes were on the ground. And if I had come in with my viewpoint and said, oh, gee, her eyes are on the ground, she must be guilty, well, that would have been the end of the transaction. Instead, I said, excuse me, your eyes are on the ground. What's going on here? She said, Professor, I dropped my contact lens. Can you help me find it? So again, there are cultural contexts that are different. If I had made a presumption and jumped into that situation with my own perspective and not asked her what was different, we would have had a very different interaction. And so what you are doing here today with this program and with the other things that you are doing to support multicultural programs, yes, you are supporting people who are different, you are making them feel welcome on campus, but you're also helping yourselves, no matter what your background, because each of you as you leave here are going to be going out and interacting with people who are different from you. And you students are going to be going out and having superiors and subordinates and colleagues and maybe loved ones who are going to be different from yourself. And you will know to ask questions rather than jump to conclusions because of the valuable training that you've gotten here at ISU. So again, I think it's very important that you've done that, and I congratulate you for doing that, and I know you're going to stay a world-class institution if you continue doing that. So let me talk a little bit about Michi Weglin as a role model for the students here. Michi was born in one of these camps that Grace just talked about so movingly. She was born on the West Coast, and she went into this camp, and she was a little bit younger than Grace. She was still in high school, and she went in as somebody who had been very active in her high school outside of the camp. She was known as a very smart person, as a very collegial person. She was active in all kinds of clubs. And going into the camps was a very difficult experience for her because suddenly she had to adjust to life behind barbed wire. Now, while she was in the camp, she made the most of it. She got involved in various activities. And ultimately, she was able to get out and go to a school, Mount Holyoke, which is a very good school up in New England. And she was there for 2 years, and she participated in different things. And people found out that she was quite good at drawing. And so she became somebody who did medical illustration, and then ultimately she did props and sets for dramatic works on campus. And eventually somebody said, gee, why don't you try costume designing? She said, costume designing? So she got interested in that, but unfortunately she developed tuberculosis. And my mom and many other people developed all kinds of high blood pressure, tuberculosis, diabetes, a lot of other things because of their forced internment experience. And so Michi had to leave school. And so if you think about it, here's a woman who started out life as a Japanese American, a discriminated against group. She's somebody who had to go behind barbed wire to one of these camps. And then on top of that, life throws her a third strike. She gets tuberculosis. Now, most of us would just say, oh, forget it. You know, I'm just going to give up. But Michi was very persistent, and she was very strong. And she turned her life around. She went back to school. She got more training. And she eventually got into costume design, not just doing any costume design. She rose up the ranks to become the costume designer for the Perry Como show. Now, some of you might remember that show. It was like the Ed Sullivan Show a generation later. It was like the shows on Comedy Central that you see now. It was sort of the American Idol of its time. And it was really very, very popular, and everybody saw her on the show. They saw the things that she did. She was a role model for all Asian Americans because she was so high up in this very highly visible field. And so you would think, okay, Michi had come from this level, had gone up to this level. That's enough for any life. But no. Michi lived through the 60s and the 70s. And this is a time when a lot of people were starting to say, you know, why are we fighting this war in Vietnam? Why are we doing these things over there? Why are we denying women and people of color and gays and lesbians and other people their civil rights? Because when you think about human rights should be the same for everyone. You know, the initial rule for human rights is called the Golden Rule. It's called do unto others as you want them to do unto you. And so ultimately, Michi decided that she would look into what had happened to the Japanese Americans because she was concerned that her experience maybe was not fair. It wasn't right to put her behind these barbed wire fences. And she read a book that was called While 6 Million Died, and it was about how the U.S. government didn't do enough to help the Jews. Some of them had come over here in boats saying, can we have refuge in this country? And Franklin Roosevelt, the great champion of civil rights, and his government had said, no, you've got to go back, and a lot of people perished. So Michi said if Roosevelt, this great icon of liberalism and of helping other people, had made this mistake, maybe he made a mistake around the Japanese American experience as well. So she determined that she would go into the archives and look at the original documents, which were just starting to become declassified. Now, it's interesting that she would decide to do that. She was not trained as a social scientist. She did not have a PhD. She did not work at a university. She was a costume designer. And so it's just audacious when you think about it. I talk to my friends who have law degrees and PhDs, and they say, you know, anybody who really knew what they were doing would never have attempted this. Because, you know, it's crazy. Why, you know, if I said to any one of the students here, stop what you're doing, go into the archives and try and find out what happened to your family 40 years ago. Well, that's comparable to what was happening to Michi. She was a young woman. She was accomplished, but not in the field that she was going into. So Michi went to the archives, and she worked for years. It took her about 8 years to write this book. And what she would do was she would have Walter support her. And Walter was very supportive because he himself had been through the concentration camp experience. Walter had had to stay inside latrines while people were doing their business, and he was hiding there as a child. He had to hide up inside ceilings, false ceilings. He had to hide inside false closets. He was on the run for the whole war. He had a terrible experience, and he knew that Michi had to explore what had happened to her people. So he supported her. She'd go into the archives, say the Federal Archives in D.C. or the Franklin Roosevelt Archives in Hyde Park, New York. She would go in at 9 o'clock with her little half sandwich. She'd walk in, and she'd look and see, you know, the documents that were there. And nobody had written a roadmap for her saying, here's where the documents are about Japanese American history. In fact, I brought some things here that are interesting that the students may want to look at. She had to fill in these forms. Here's one that says, Dear Sir, I wish to receive notice of U.S. government publications. And she sent this to the U.S. government printing office, and they would send her back a form like this. She'd have to fill it in. You know, it's not like you could go online and say, I'd like to have all the documents related to Japanese Americans. Click. I'll go get my cappuccino and come back and have it sitting here for me. No, it's not the way it worked back then. I mean, many of us remember the days when we had to do, you know, mimeos. When we had, you know, there were wet copies and dry copies. I mean, nowadays you just pull out your student card, put it in, press a button, 10 copies come out. When Michi wanted to research something, she went into the archives, she found these documents. And don't forget, she wasn't a lawyer, she wasn't a PhD. She had to go to say to somebody, who is this guy? I noticed there's something written about him. His name is Henry Stimson. And then somebody would say, oh, well, he was the Secretary of War at that time. Oh, okay. And then she'd have to find out more about him. So she would make one copy. She'd get her little coin purse out and put the change in. She'd have to walk over and make a copy. And then when she got home, she'd maybe have a few copies made. She'd put one in her file for, let's see, here's something from the War Department to the President. And don't forget, we didn't call it the Defense Department at the time. We called it the War Department, which was probably a little more honest. Here's a letter that was written in 1942. So Michi would have a letter that was written. She'd make a copy for her 1942 file. And she'd have another one made for her Henry Stimson file, like the one here. And she'd have another one made for another file. Because remember, this is before there was a computer. In fact, this is one of my favorite documents in looking at all of Michi's documents. This is what cut and paste was. Before Microsoft Word, you were handwriting something, and I think this goes better here, so I'll cut it and put it here, and this one goes here, and I'll put a little red mark here. So a lot of the things that the students have grown up with Microsoft Word doing, we had to do this by hand. So this is how Michi pieced together the story of what had happened to her people. So when the government said that there was a military necessity for putting people in these camps, Michi figured out there was no military necessity. In fact, the big story was that the Secretary of the Navy, the head of the FBI, a lot of other people had determined that the Japanese Americans were not a threat. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI at that time, and no softy on communism or any other problem, he said, in fact, I think Japanese Americans are overwhelmingly loyal. And I found a few people who I think may be disloyal, and on December 7th and 8th, I moved them away, put them away from the rest of the population. You don't have to round up all these other people. And yet, the forces of discrimination, the forces of greed prevailed. Some farming groups and others who wanted that land that the Japanese Americans had been working on, they said, let's take these Japanese Americans and put them into these camps. And Grace very eloquently described what happened to her family and some of the other people at Gila and some of the other camps. So Michi found this out. She went through all these records. She found so many records that had to be declassified. And as a parenthetical note, unfortunately what's happening now is over the last 8 years, we've seen documents get more and more classified. We've seen less and less transparency with our government. And I'm hoping that the new president is going to start allowing us to look at the government documents again and make things more transparent, because the lifeblood of democracy is us being able to see what our government is doing. Because I'm not saying everyone did something like putting people in the camps, but it's very important that we, the people, control the three branches of government, and understanding that we have to be able to see our documents. So Michi did her research, and once she was done, she started writing this book. This book is very, very well written. And one thing she did that was very important is, as a costume designer, she knew it was important to put pictures in there. So when you look at the picture of the little Japanese-American girl who was here with a little tag, you heard Grace talk about how she was family 6251. You know, this, I can't read the number on here, but everybody had their little tag, and you say, what kind of a threat was this person to the life of people in this country? And she put maps, she put the original documents that were here. I remember I was writing an article for the Yale Law Journal back in 1984-85, and I said I wanted to use the word concentration camps because that's what it was. It was a place where people were concentrated. The word came actually from the Boer War back in 1902, when the people from Great Britain rounded up the Boer people, the Afrikaans-speaking people in South Africa, and put them behind barbed wire. And so this was, in fact, a rounding up of people, segregating them from the population. And so the people at the Yale Law Journal said, well, prove it. So Michi sent me a bunch of documents from President Roosevelt, from Secretary of the Navy Knox, all these other people saying concentration camp, concentration camp, concentration camp. And, of course, what Walter suffered in Europe was a death camp. They were put, you know, there's another euphemism there. It wasn't just concentrating. Hitler put people to death. So it's important to remember to use these words, and Michi was very, very diligent at using the right words. And her book pulled no punches. She started out by saying Japanese Americans were put in these camps because Roosevelt wanted a hostage reserve. He wanted to trade people like Grace and trade them for real Americans, for white Americans, in case, you know, there were some people who were captured. We wanted to be able to have this hostage reserve barter. And these are the horrible things we like to think about. My mom and Neil and Grace and others, they were not treated as real Americans just because of their racial ancestry. So Michi's book found that out. She also found a very interesting fact, that we had gone as a U.S. government down to Central and South America and kidnapped a lot of people of Japanese ancestry and brought them up here. And this hostage taking was not something Americans should do. We did it, and ultimately those people have not been compensated yet. So we still need some redress for those people. But most of the Japanese Americans received redress, as Grace pointed out, and Michi was instrumental in that. So Michi's book in 1976 galvanized a redress movement. People who believed they had been wrong needed the factual underpinning for lawsuits and for other ways of getting compensation. We brought bills before Congress. So ultimately, we had to pursue redress in a way that many groups have had to pursue redress. First, you do research, Then you put together your claim. What do you think went wrong? Well, all we did was we took the Bill of Rights and dumped it into a legal complaint, because the freedom of religion, the freedom of assembly, the freedom from arbitrary search and seizure, all these different things had been done. And so we as lawyers drafted these complaints. Other people went before Congress. And ultimately, in 1988, a bill was signed, and we did get redress. So Michi was instrumental in what many people view as one of the most successful redress movements of American history. And this was done by a woman who was a costume designer, who had been in the camps, who had had tuberculosis, and yet she found the wherewithal to do all these things. So as I look back at Michi's life, I found 10 different lessons. Looking back on 10 years of Michi, what are the 10 things that Michi taught to me looking back on her life? Well, the first one is something that you all are doing right now, and that is never forgetting. Always look back on your own family. I had a very nice experience this morning with one of your classes here in Asian American Studies, where we got to talk about our own families and where we had been, who our family members were. And it's important to always remember that, because if you look back and understand your own family, it helps you to place yourself in this world and then start to figure out where you want to go in the future. So she didn't forget. The second thing she did was to live a life with purpose. And again, I've enjoyed so much speaking with your students. They're very dynamic. It's been a pleasure. They're very, very intelligent, and I congratulate the faculty and administration on keeping them going, because they're very, very dynamic. But this, I was talking to the students about living life with purpose, because Michi lived a very successful life. She did well, but she also remembered that she had to do good. And in doing so, she gave up that career in costume design. She went in and started researching. She didn't know where it would end. It was very difficult. But ultimately, she did good. She was able to help out her people to get this redress, to vindicate Japanese Americans. The third thing she did was to be yourself. Now, it was very hard for a Japanese American woman at that time to be herself, because Hollywood, the fashion industry, everything was saying, hey, you're ugly. You're not what you want. You're not a person who should feel good about yourself. And ultimately, it was the women's movement of the 70s. It was the Black Pride movement. It was a lot of these movements that helped us all to feel good no matter who we are. We're human beings. Everyone should feel good about themselves. And Michi was herself in a way that, was gave me a great inspiration, because she took the best of her background and she used it to empower herself and move forward and do all these great things. The fourth thing she did was she aimed high. Again, she aimed to be a costume designer. She got to the top of her field. When she wanted to write a book, she wrote a blockbuster of a book. It was an award-winning book, and other historians, other people said, gee, where'd you find all these documents? I don't believe you. Where'd you get all this? She put it right here in the book, and she was able to do a lot of research and help other people do their research. So she aimed very, very high, and she succeeded. The fifth thing she did that's an important lesson for every student is to never, ever, ever, ever give up. And she refused to be intimidated as a Japanese American woman. She refused to be intimidated as a woman. She refused to be intimidated as a fashion designer. She refused to be intimidated as a person without a PhD or a JD. She said, darn it, I want to find out the truth, and I'm going to do it. And she just went ahead and did that. And that's a lesson for anyone, no matter what your gender or your sexual orientation or anything. You should be yourself. You should never give up in trying to do the things that you want to do. The sixth thing she did that is vital is she always told the truth. And again, Walter was a big part of that, because Walter himself had suffered. And he said, Michi, don't pull back. FDR was to blame, then put the blame at his feet. If there's other people who didn't do enough, the National ACLU didn't do much. It was a Northern California chapter of the ACU that helped out. The church groups didn't do anything. They were bad on this issue. The American Friends, the Quakers were good on this issue, but some of the other church groups did not do enough. And so Michi went out there and said, hey, you all have to be better on these issues. She didn't pull any punches. And it's important that we do that, because looking back, having these days of remembrance means not just whitewashing and saying happy, happy, joy, joy. It means saying, hey, we've made mistakes. We're human beings. How can we get better? How can we do more for other people? I like Grace's ending where we say, what can we do more for our brothers and sisters who are Muslim, who are Arab, who look differently, who have different gods, who have different ways of doing things? Each of us is an American and a person worthy of humanity and respect. So That's an important lesson that we take away from our experience here. The seventh thing that Michi taught me was to savor your life. Michi was a person who not only was very serious, she did her research, she also was a person, every time we did research, we would go out and have dinner. And as a young student and then a law student, it was very nice to have somebody treat you to dinner, believe me. So it's important that you build community, you have friends, you get together as students in your clubs or whatever you're doing, and you break bread together. You have a good time together because these are the best days of your life. You need to get together and to build solidarity, to build strength, so that whatever you do with your life, as you're trying to find purpose with your life, you will have a supportive network to keep you going. The eighth thing that Michi taught us is to live your art. And again, it's hard to think about art in these days of budget cutbacks because we say, oh, art is something that's superfluous. Actually, Professor Dusselier just wrote a very important book about art in the camps. And I encourage you to read that book as well because it talks about how art helped to sustain people. It helped them gave them something to do every day. It helped them to, something with your name on your barrack was more than just a place to find where your barrack was. It was also an expression of your creativity. It was an expression of who you were. And it was something that helped you to ground yourself because you would be ripped out of one place to go from your home to this relocation center, and then you're being dislocated, but you could bring a little piece of yourself, of your little island of stability with yourself through your art. And art is now very important for refugees who are in refugee camps, and frankly, it's important for all of us. I'm sure we all enjoy music, dancing, graphic arts, whatever you enjoy. That's something that gives you purpose and meaning. And so Michi was living that, and it's very important that she did. The ninth lesson of Michi is to share your gifts. Michi, again, was a costume designer. She was an artist, but she made sure to reach out to everyone else. One thing about her book is that she wrote a book, and if she had been a faculty member somewhere, she could have then used that to just get tenure for herself and just keep everything for herself. But instead, Michi shared with everyone. There are literally hundreds of plays, papers, books, dance pieces, so many things that were inspired by Michi because she would go out and write to people. I remember I wrote a play 30 years ago, and she sent me an envelope of documents saying, these are things you should think about as you are writing and doing some creative work. It's very important that she did that because she, as an older person, was able to be inspirational. As I look at the older people here in the audience, each of you has something important to share with some of these students. Each of you has learned lessons in your life. It's important to share those lessons with these people who are just starting their life's journey. The 10th and most important lesson that I take from Michi's life is to live every day as if you're living in the future. The future starts right now. I am building a world around me that is the world that I want. It's a world where everyone can be themselves. It's a world where I can, talk about Asian American studies. I can learn about gay and lesbian people. I can learn about everyone and celebrate each of these people in their difference. I can be different and they can be different. And Michi was a type of person who, even as she was working on Years of Infamy, she went down to the South African embassy and protested against apartheid. She was a type of person who was very active in women's issues. She was very concerned about her broader world, and she tried to make that world part of her everyday experience. So whether you're in a community group, a church group, among your friends here on campus, try to bring people together and remind them about those higher values, going beyond tolerance to true understanding. And again, I'd like to close by just saying thank you very much to the ISU administrators, the faculty, the staff, the students, for sponsoring this Day of Remembrance, for inviting the three of us here to speak, and for showing that type of spirit of generosity and of multiculturalism that is going to keep ISU a top university into the future. Thank you very much.
I just want to clarify the fact that you had mentioned that I had written the book, but it just is that I'm in one of the chapters of the book of the U.S. Cadet Nurse Corps book that was written by Thelma Robinson. And she had written a book about the Cadet Nurse Corps, and in doing all this work and writing the book, she realized how many of us Japanese American students and were cadet nurses, and felt that in her book it is the Cadet Nurse Corps, the Nisei Cadet Nurse Corps students, saying patriotism in spite of prejudice. And so I just wanted to clarify that, and I'm so proud to be one of those that was interviewed for the book. Thank you.
It's really an honor to come up here and to not only thank Phil Nash for his really inspiring talk, Neil Nakadati for the poetry that I know has been inspiring him for some time now, and Grace Obata Amamiya for her role, I think, not only on campus in bringing her life to our classes, but also to her life in the community. And I would love to give her a key to the city, which we don't have, surprisingly, in Ames. But I think she certainly deserves one. So we're going to give her something that comes as close as possible to that key to the city. And it is the key to the campus. I think many of you know there is a Plaza of Heroines in front of Cat Hall. And we want to honor Grace with a brick in that plaza for her heroic efforts.
My husband and family would be so proud of that. Thank you.
It's really an honor also, I want to make sure we say this, that we remember today, this day of remembrance, those who really suffered and were incarcerated in those camps. I think that was, of course, the reason that we have this particular day. And I think it's a pleasure, and it's been a wonderful opportunity to have both our visitors and Grace with us. Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Jane DeSalia for all of her hard work in helping to organize this. And on the back of your program are a list of sponsors. Without their help, this certainly wouldn't have happened today. So thank you very much.